Welcome everyone to the presentation of 7 helpful principles for balancing and economy design. And let me introduce myself first. So who am I? I'm a generalist game designer. I have 10 plus years experience, depending how you calculate it, even more. But that's about like, the design experience that I have professionally. And also I am a generalist. I've also been doing a little bit of everything in design and outside design, but my primary specialization is systems and also secondarily in economy and balancing. I also have a connection to Kajaani. I'm a CAMK alumni, and my work has taken me around the world, but for the past almost 6 years I've been working at Ubisoft Redlynx in Helsinki. And some expectation management. What should you expect from the presentation? I'll be talking about the principles, giving some examples to give you an idea of the mindset required for balancing an economy, which means that there is no hard focus on the details, calculations, or nitty-gritty stuff, but I will give examples and at times also provide some references where you can get deeper into the intricacies of the economy. The presentation starts with more general principles and then slowly moves towards the economy-focused ones at the end. And if you have any questions about something more detailed, workflows or stuff like that, or just the presentation itself, then please ask me questions at the end of presentation, or you can contact me after the presentation otherwise. So, without further ado, let's start with our first principle, which is treat balance as an action. What it means is that there's no one true balance. There are a lot of different kind of balances in game, and it's better to consider balancing as an action or as an act of changing relative relationships between things. If player says game is well balanced, it can mean very many things. It's kind of vague, sounds similarly to a fun game, and it's not very useful information for a developer as such. Of course, it's good to know that your game is, or the player feels positive things about your game, but it's not really something that you can act on. And being well balanced can look like any of these following things. This is well balanced. 3 weapons equally high on power on an arbitrary power scale. This is also well balanced. 3 weapons increased in power from weak to powerful. And this is also well balanced. 3 weapons equally low on the power. So all of them are equally well balanced. They're good balances. But what the difference is that they have different purposes that they are for. Each gives out a different kind of experience, and they can work in different scenarios. So if we look at some example games, we can understand better where these types of power balances could work. So first, the equally high power weapons. It can be really good at encouraging a power fantasy like Doom. It's all about just blasting the demons, having that rush, feeling like you're very powerful. The increasing power curve can be really good for traditional RPG experience. You are on journey, you gain new weapons, companions, you gain more power, that the longer the journey goes on, and ultimately you're ready to take on the world-ending obstacle, enemy or entity. And equally low powered weapons can also be very good for a horror game experience and creating that feeling of powerlessness. Of course, Resident Evil, which is in the screenshot, is not maybe the best example. I think it's more balanced with scarcity of ammunition, but in general, horror games, you can use this kind of balancing to create the tension and the feeling of fear. So if we give a correct purpose, we can work with a variety of different balances. And you just need to have the correct context and correct purpose for the balance. And this leads us to the next principle, which is having a purpose. So whatever we do, it's with either balancing or generally in design, it only works or works well if the purpose is there. And this is why, and yes, there's such cases in actual professional game development where numbers are simply copied from one game to another game with different context or different purpose. And that kind of approach doesn't really work. And we can take a look at some or the previous game examples and their balances if we put them with a different purpose or with different kind of power scaling. So what would happen if we would have equally low power weapons in duel? Well, this would obviously create a conflict with the idea of the power fantasy, because demons would just take minimal damage, you would just feel overwhelmed, you would feel powerless, and that's not really what the game is going for. Or if in Final Fantasy V or in the RPG games, you would have equally mid-powered weapons. You would lose that feeling of growth, you would lose that improvement on the journey, so things would kind of feel like you're not really progressing, at least on the power scale, and any new weapons or companions would feel stale or just more visual because they would not have that kind of like power increase. Or what if a horror game or even Resident Evil would have all high-powered weapons? Likely there would not be a feeling of helplessness if the player can eliminate all threats with ease. You would just blow up all the zombies with weapons and you would feel like, oh, that wasn't that bad, I just cleared the city. And this is exactly the reason why when you're thinking about the purpose for the game's balance or economy, well, you should know what is the purpose of the game, of course, but you should also know the effects that each type of balancing or structure could have. Developing different games, it will help you to understand how systems work, as does analyzing the games you play. But if you want to learn faster, you can also learn generalized patterns, either in economy or overall in design, and then start recognizing them in the games when you play games, when you analyze games, and when you develop games. So it can help you improve to see, hey, I did this thing, I was expecting this kind of result based on the pattern, and then you notice like, hey, this was the difference, this is why I got different result that I expected. And here are a couple of references that you can start with. So first, this book, Building Blocks of Tabletop Game Design, is not really directly applicable to video games or economy, but it contains a variety of patterns for tabletop games that can be adapted to video games. And this can work as a good base to start learning about patterns, especially since all tabletop games have like the rules available, they're visible, and there are no hidden systems like usually in video games. Then a book from Ernest Adams and Joris Dormans. This is one that I really recommend for economy patterns. It contains a visualized way to think of economy, and it ties into the economy tool Machinations that started as a more indie kind of own individual system, but then later on it became like a service that you can buy, or you can even use for free, but there are some limitations. Why I suggest the book? I tried to look for them. I'm not sure if all the economy patterns are available in the internet anymore, but the book contains base knowledge and a set of patterns to start with and build upon. And this book can work as a really good base to start thinking about economy, especially in a systematic way. And this was really helpful for me when I was starting to learn more about economy, so I can really recommend it as a starting point. And yeah, there's lots of good materials that you can learn from if you just know where to look. But since this presentation focuses more on the general principles and mindset, I'm not going to go any deeper on this. But if you want more references or more information after the presentation, you can send me a message. And now Using the patterns and understanding of systems, this is a good bridge to lead us to the next principle, which is understanding the relationships. So, when you start to think about balancing in practice or designing the economy for a game, you need to know what or how you should balance. And at the beginning, it's very easy to get focused on just tuning individual variables, whether you're thinking like whether it should be this or that number, you're feeling it out, and then you move on to the next variable, and the whole economy or the balancing is basically just like based on your feeling. And if you are doing it, that's totally fine. But instead of just feeling them out, I do suggest that it's better to first start thinking things in a bigger perspective. You ensure the purpose, that you're aligned with things, and you're thinking about the balance or the economy more on a systems level. And let's take a look at an example from individual versus system perspective. So we have a hypothetical RPG game. The game has a weapon, which is on the right. It's a sword. It has 5 damage. So if I would ask a question, is the sword a good weapon or is it a bad weapon? Of course, now, like, I'm not making you answer, but it's a hypothetical question, and the answer is, in isolation, we cannot really say. It is possible that if you, or when you start to think about the question, you might be thinking, when you're trying to kind of figure out this damage 5, is it lot or little? You might be thinking of games like Final Fantasy XIV, where the damage can end up being in thousands. And if it's that high, the sword is pretty much useless. It's also possible that you're thinking of games where the damage is in single digits, which in Starbound with the dagger, it's 3 damage, so it's almost double, so making the sword a very viable weapon in that context. And this is actually what we need. So when you're thinking about the variables or the values, you need always something to compare it with, so that we can put that value in context. So if we have that weapon, if we know all the weapons in the game, like now we see that on the right, and we know that the damage would range from 1 to 5, the weapon would position as powerful or the most powerful within the weapons category. If the weapons range from 1 to 1000 damage, well, we know that the sword positions as relatively weak within the weapons category. It's likely it's a starting weapon. But even with this knowledge, we only know how the weapons relate to each other. So that's not enough. What we need is an enemy. We need to know the use case where we're using it. And with games, it usually be like if you have weapons, you need an enemy that you use it against. And for the enemy, we need to know how much health the enemies have so we can know how the damage compares to it. And this is the counter pair, damage and health. Very, very familiar. And is this enough to know how the sword compares to the health? Not really. Because even if we know the different variables, we need to know the formula. Because depending on the formula, the dealt damage can be very different. Let's take an example. With damage formula 1, there are no other factors to count for. The damage is directly reducing the health, and that makes the calculation and the estimation of numbers very easy. You have 20 health, you minus or reduce 5 damage, so you have 15 health points. Very easy, very simple. In damage formula 2, we have other variables in play, like armor or resistance. And in this case, the enemy has a shield, so armor. The damage is altered before calculating the health difference. So now instead of damage going fully through, we have an alternative variable that will reduce the damage to 3 before it goes through. So the enemy has more health points left. So because of the need to have additional calculations to estimate the relationship between the damage and the health, it also makes it harder to instantly estimate the numbers. We need to do some mental math or actual math. And there's a lot more ways, way more than what I showed, to calculate the values. Just to give you an idea that variables and formulas are important, or you need to know both. And each of the different formulas provide different benefits in controlling the end result of that calculation. All options are pretty much viable as long as you just know the correct context you're using the formulas and the calculations in. And you need to have that proper purpose. So now that we know the values, the variables, and formulas, we know also the purpose, and we are looking for multiple options. But we're still missing one more thing. Because in games, the formulas are activated by interaction, and that interaction is dependent on inputs external to the game. And balancing the game properly requires the evaluation and prediction of this most chaotic component of an economic system or game systems in general, which is the player. These interactions can be so heavily affected by things like players' choices and skill, so even if we just purely math it out, it's not enough to know that math between the objects and the systems. So if we need to know, or we need to calculate for the player's action as part of the system, how do we do that? Well, we need to know the audience. And because predicting and anticipating players' behavior is really difficult, as players can pretty much come up with anything. They can do whatever they feel like. Player could go on a different path from what the developers have intended. It could lead to a variety of consequences that can be immediate. You can see it immediately, like something broke really badly, or it can appear over time. Let's check a couple of examples on what could happen if player has a different kind of choice. So in a progression-wise, if player finds a super optimal route, maybe it allows players to use less time or resources, or maybe they just gain more power than intended. This can cause issues later on if the player has more ammunition, more health, more powerful items on sections of game, which have been then balanced for a smaller level of power or resources. This is not bad for all players, because, for example, speedrunners, they're trying to find optimized routes, so that's good for them. But also those are good examples how much the super optimal routes can actually influence the gameplay. And it's also possible that player takes a route that leads to suboptimal route or suboptimal performance and progression. It can use more resources than player is supposed to use. They might miss out on important items or skills, and this can lead the game to be a lot harder than it was supposed to be. And this can have the consequence of players having way more harder time than they were supposed to have. It can even lead to a bad situation where they cannot be moving on from a later part of the game because they don't have enough resources, they don't have enough items or skills. But then how can we predict what the players could do? Since it's not really reasonable to try to determine all the possibilities that the players might take, it's important that we limit the number of possibilities that we examine from the player. And we can do this when we just know the limits of our game and when we know our audience better. So let's take a look. Let's look at some examples on limiting the options in progression. So if the game has a linear progression, or we can kind of like get it down to linear progression, it'll be easier to determine what actions the player can take. In this case, we can use the important points or the bigger points, like in the flow on the right, A and B, to measure the progression. Because if we know that major changes in the economy or major items or key items are changing only at those points, like in the example, we know what the player has on A, and in B they lose the key item 1 and gain a weapon 2, then we know that we can just focus on balancing things between A to B route with what they have, and then after they reach B, we know what we need to do to balance things from B onwards. So that makes us able to tune the challenges according to that knowledge. If we have branching progression, it's very similar to linear progression. We can still measure the player's progression with the major areas, and we can focus our attention to the player's actions within the route. The difference, of course, is that what if, or is it possible that player can always go through all areas? So let's say from A to B to C, or from A to C to B, and do they gain all the items? Or can player only go through one of the areas, so they always choose either B and C and then move on to the next area like D? And this knowledge pretty much changes things a lot, because we need to calculate what are the required items and gained items from the areas and balance things accordingly or against those. Or should we only count for one major point where we know that they have less of those key items before, of course, the player moves on? And then we have open progression, which is definitely the hardest to determine. It does use the same kind of major points to know what the players have, but since player can freely move between places, it's really hard to pull off with a static economy. Often in games, there's some kind of well thought out systems that can scale and or dynamic balancing. For example, if this would be an RPG game, and let's say player starts at level 1, they move from A as the starting point to a next city, whichever they go to, they face level 1 obstacles. And if they level up, we can make it so that they face level 2 obstacles. This is a very simplified example, but this would make it already easier to balance the game and ensure that the game does not break on an unintended path. Another common way to handle the open progression is to gate things, to have the main progression be gated, and then guide players through the certain major areas in certain order. And this will limit the player's action. We don't really need to care as much what player does or where, as long as they just eventually move through that intended progression. Of course, this depends so much on your game, what kind of systems, what kind of progression you have. But if you want to have the major points in your game fleshed out and have more linear, then it's easier to predict, like, hey, these are the things that player can do, and they will not gain more power before they are moving here, or they got these items or these weapons. So knowing how the player might progress through the game allows us to use those major areas as balancing point for the important parts of the game. But there's another factor we need to know to balance the game further, and this is to know the targeted audience of the game. And the targeted players or the target audience are pretty much the main players that you will balance the game for. Because there might be, even within the overall audience, all the players that you have in the game, there can be multiple archetypes, there can be varying levels of skill, or there can be varying levels of play styles. And the thing is that when you set the numbers once, if you don't have a dynamic system, you can only then change or tune the next numbers that you have, but you cannot really change all of the numbers, or depending on your system, of course, but there will be times when you need to choose who do you balance for. And this is, the targeted audience is exactly the question, or the answer to this question. Let's take an example of a shooter. You might need to decide, is the shooter more casual, or, and like, of course, like more relaxed gameplay, not so tense, or are you making a competitive shooter where players want to have really fair but tight matches with intense gameplay? Well, usual, very common option is to have different game modes. We might have, like, for example, Overwatch. It has arcade game modes. that allows us to use the same systems and balance the game for more casual and mainstream audience. And of course, then having a competitive game mode or ranked game mode where you can balance the game for more critical, for more intense gameplay, where you need to maybe use even more of the game, like use of the game's mechanics, like communication. And then the question is, how do you get to know the targeted audience or targeted players? Well, you can use various methods. I'm naming just a few of them. But you can, for example, play your computer games. You can do research on the game, those games, players on forums. You try to find patterns there. You can look if there's any available market research or analysis on those games with some, with player data. Or of course, if you have money, you can do it on your own. It's also possible to do user research tests to find out the kind of things that the players or your players or the players that you're researching would engage with your game, what they like in your game, and what kind of players they are. And with different kind of groups, you can get different results, so you might try with different kind of audiences in the user research. And if you have live game, you can use analytics to track how the players are playing, what they're doing in the game, look at all the possible actions. And this usually helps you in knowing your game better as well, as long as you can just track properly what players are doing, where they are, and how they're progressing in the game. So it's very useful. And once you use those methods to know your target audience, or the target audiences, because you might have different players if you have a game that supports different modes, for example, you know what they like to do, you know when they want to do stuff, you can categorize them into groups with common patterns, and then when you have that information, then you can use those groups to evaluate what kind of balance changes you might take, or if you need to do some balance changes for changing your game, keeping the competitive fresh, or you are adding new content and that changes the balance, you can kind of try to predict what kind of behavior, or based on their known behavior, you can kind of try to decipher what kind of reaction they might have, how is it influencing their gameplay. For example, let's say in RTS you have 3 different factions. You know that, let's assume that each of them have a different audience. For just the sake of example, you have the users of all different factions and you balance one. You will know that only those factions, that the most affected faction will be those people that are playing with that faction, and then those are partially are also affected, but not as much, the other factions that play against the altered faction. And now that we have the knowledge about the purpose, the game, and the player, we can move on to a more detailed level of balancing. And this principle is about using the common denominator. So when you have a game, there might be multiple entities within each system to balance for. Or in some cases, you need to balance multiple systems that need to be in balance with each other. As long as you have same variables, same formulas, it is fairly easy to balance because you can just compare the values directly. It's easy to say like, hey, this has like a damage and health, this has damage and health, they work pretty much the same. Okay, if I do these changes, I know pretty much how it works. It's very intuitive. But things become a lot harder when there are different types of variables and value types. Then how do we approach balancing this? Well, we can approach this problem by finding the common denominator. So, common denominator can be any kind of value that other values are or can be tied to. It can be a value inside the game, like health points, or it can be more universal value, like time. We have to decide what the common denominator is. We can do it based on how we want to balance it, when you know your game, it's easier to say what it should be. But calculating that common denominator when you have decided it is very similar than like to the math equivalent of common denominators. So let's say we want to know the relationship between A and C. We cannot really just assume the ratio being 3 to 2 in this case, or 1.5 to 1 if we just make it smaller, because the issue is that they don't have that common denominator. So we need to calculate that, and I assume all of you have gone through the school math where you find the ratio. So you basically, the easiest way is just to multiply the denominators with each other to find the common denominator. And when we have that, or when we do that, we find the common denominator, and now we know what is the actual ratio between the numbers. So in this case, A and C is 21, or A is 21 and C is 10. So we know the actual ratio was 2.1 to 1 instead of 1.5 to 1. And this is important because if you would calculate that ratio wrong, it means that the calculation, like if you use that, for example, as a percentage, the calculation were off 60%. And that can become very big issue if the number is repeatedly used to calculate something. For example, in level scaling of an RPG or an RTS battle. If you have just a single instance, you might not see as much balance difference. It's still like pretty hefty, 60% off. But the more units battle each other, let's say it's a unit balance to another unit balance thing, then if you have those two types of units and you see that they clash each other in big masses, you will see like an overwhelming dominance for the other type. So basically it could lead to one unit type being overpowered compared to the other unit type or types, depending how you balance your game. And let's take an example on how we would calculate the common denominator on a hypothetical game example. Again, let's take an RPG, and as common denominator, let's use time. And just for the sake of this presentation, I don't want to get really complicated or overcomplicate the calculations because there's a lot even in basic combat. Let's just focus on attack interaction. And again, we have the sword with 5 damage, we have enemy with 20 health, and we have a direct damage formula. So you can just easily say that, hey, if we have this much damage, the health is reduced. So with this damage formula, we can easily calculate how many hits it takes to defeat the enemy, which is we divide the health by the damage of the one hit of our sword, and we will get 4 hits. And since we want to balance around time, which also in this case, when you use time as a common denominator, it paces the game and creates a certain kind of game feel. Let's say we want to defeat the enemy in 6 seconds. So we know that the enemy is defeated in 4 hits, and that needs to happen in 6 seconds. On the right, you can see the visualization to help us see how the calculation goes. So for the first attack, if we assume that the cooldown doesn't happen before the attacks, we know that the first attack happens at second 0. This will leave us 3 attacks for the 6 seconds. So if we divide that 6 seconds with the 3 attacks, we will get a ratio of 1 attack every 2 seconds. Pretty simple. But now what if we want to introduce an ability for the enemy? We just want to make things a little bit more interesting. Let's say the enemy gets a healing ability, so they can get some of the health back during the battle. We need to decide on the time that the enemy will get back, and meaning what time the enemy will get back is because health is now tied around the time through the attacks. So since the healing prolongs the battle, we don't want to make it too long from the 6 seconds. So let's say that the enemy will gain 2 seconds worth time more same as one attack would. And this means that basically one heal will counter one attack. And it also means if we want to only prolong the battle for 2 seconds, we don't really want the enemy to use the health ability more than once. So if we update the damage calculation, now basically you attack, or the enemy has one heal, so 2 extra seconds worth of time in the battle, which means it counters the one attack, so player needs to have one attack more. But let's say we want to balance this again. We still want, even with the heal, we want the battle to be 6 seconds, so we can now introduce a counter for the heal. Let's introduce explosion magic. And we need to counter it or balance it to counter the heal. And as we know, one heal equals to one attack. They're both 2 seconds. So what we want to do, we want to negate that one heal, and we want to deal regular damage on top of it, because we want to keep the same time with the original attacks. So we can calculate that explosion magic is 4 seconds, which means 2 attacks worth, or 1 heal and 1 attack. And now we basically counter from that 8 seconds. We could calculate it with 8 seconds and then show that that one takes just 4 seconds, but just for the sake of showing that everything happens in 6 seconds, we just put those there. And that was a very simple example. It also works better when you go very complex, or like it works the same way, but it makes more sense when you actually have more different types of calculations, but I don't want to delve too deep into that. What is important is that the common denominator allows us to quickly set values based on it. We can calculate the ratios, and then as we know the other values like health and damage, we can fill in those values based on the common denominator, because we always know what is the value of one variable and another variable compared to the common denominator. And with this, it's easy to implement something like leveling system as long as you know the base variables. For example, if we want to do a level up and you double the health, and we still want to keep the battles in 6 seconds, we know that the damage needs to also double to keep the ratio the same. And as the common denominator, you can use it as a universal thing or universal value inside the game, like the whole game and all the systems, or you can limit it within a subset of systems. And that limitation actually leads us to the next principle, which is isolating the systems. Because while balancing well, or while doing a complex game, and while using common denominator to allow us to balance a lot of different types of systems, we don't really want to make everything connected to each other. If we make some variables in the game, like gold, and we used to buy for everything, we might run into issues like conflicting choices, messy progression, and also have overcomplicated balancing, which makes it hard to, or difficult to upkeep and tune. Well, let's look at an example with that gold as in a hypothetical scenario. So this is a very common pattern in RPG games, where a player has gold, they got it from defeating enemies or wherever, and that can be used to buy weapons, it can be used to buy healing items or new magic. So player has a choice. And this type of thing is totally fine. This is very common, it's used. It works out. But what if that gold would also be used to buy new characters for the party? The issue in this is that now we have an additional choice between the items, the equipment or the weapons, the items and the skills or the magic. And then we also need to balance it out for a character. It might be okay in some cases, but this is especially problematic if you have a character, or the character that you buy is the one using the abilities. If we think about from player's perspective, How does the player know whether they should buy the character or the weapons, items, and magic? How do they know which is the best option to take? Also, what happens if player uses their money on a character that is less useful than using the previous character and just buying the better weapons? These can lead to a suboptimal progression, which, again, what we went through, can lead into other kind of issues. So what should we do in this kind of case? The solution is to isolate the character gaining as its own thing, and what we can do, we can give a specialized currency for gaining the characters. Specialized currencies allow us to separate the systems, make more linear progression for predictability, and ensuring that players actually use the currencies to progress in the correct things. It makes the structure more clear because you can think, hey, as a player I get orbs, it means I'm getting more characters. If I get gold, I'm getting power for the characters. And the best thing, it will be easier to balance and also to understand. You can isolate systems by creating specialized variables to use as currencies or resources for them, and you can make them work only within the system. And this kind of thing, when you have those specialized variables in moderation as well, it creates a clear structure that is a better experience for the player, and it is easier to tune and upkeep. What it also does is that the specialized currencies have an added value, and that makes it something that players want to get. And that functions as a bridge to move on to the final principle, which is balancing for the game experience. Although it is possible to create a highly balanced system or a game with just math, it's not really enough. Because ultimately we are making entertainment, and the balance and the economy is for the game to be enjoyable, and it is meant to support the fantasy and player experience. I have an example from one of my previous co-workers, which kind of relates to this. So he was working on RPGs for a long while. And at one point he started working on a shooter, and his lead tasked him to do some kind of power up or power increase in that FPS game. Well, he did like he used to with the RPGs, and he gave 5 to 10% boost for the player. And I think it was damage as well. So the players tested the game, they were not really happy, and they felt like, oh, there's no power boost. The designer was thinking like, oh, why are they unhappy? Why did they say that the boost was not working? And eventually he figured out why, or the reason why. The players in the fast-paced action game did not really have time or even interest in calculating the number changes, because the only thing that mattered at the moment or in that moment was feeling that there's a power change. And this led to his rule about RPG and FPS balancing. And when you're working on a pure number change, or on a number-oriented game and have a pure number change, like some percentages, it is very math-heavy, and that's more RPG balancing. And if you are working on FPS, you want to make things feel more different, you want to make them feel impactful, you do more FPS balancing. And of course, in this case, we want to know like, what does it mean that it feels different? How do we determine that our balancing actually feels impactful? It's not just numbers changing for the player. We can take a look at an example for that. The answer to the question is breakpoints. And what I mean by breakpoints, there are moments when a number change causes something bigger to change in the game. It might change other variables, other values, and more universal things to change. That bigger change can be things like number of hits or the amount of time. As an example, let's go back to the sword and enemy. We have the base, same sword, same enemy, 20 health, formalized direct damage. Currently taking down the enemy with that sword requires 4 hits, 3 cooldowns, and 6 seconds. So now we want to introduce the damage change value. When do we know that it actually feels more impactful? Try 1, we add 20% damage or +1 damage. The damage is higher, and in RPG, when you see the number calculate, number indicators when you hit, you know that the damage increase. We also see from the formula the damage is higher, that we also, instead of 4 hits, it's 3.333, but although it is lower than 4, we don't have partial hits, which means that you still need the 4th hit to actually do the damage. And it will still take 4 hits, 3 cooldowns, and 6 seconds to be defeated. But it just means that we're still outside a breakpoint. So let's keep adding the damage. So now we try with 40% added damage or 2 extra damage. If we calculate the health to damage ratio, we notice that we get under 3, which means that it will be rounded up to 3. Now the enemy will be taken down with 3 hits instead of 4. The attack there will be 2 cooldowns instead of 3, and the battle will last 4 seconds instead of 6. The breakpoints was reached, so we know that the player can feel a difference. Even though in this case it might be fairly small, but it's still impactful. And again, if you have lots of those enemies, you will notice that there's a clear difference to that battle, because you will start to run those areas faster. And one good thing to remember about breakpoints is that they do not always need to happen to same entities. So if you do some different power increases, you can target different enemies, like 1 level up or 1 power increase, making enemy number 1 reach breakpoint. Second level up can make enemy number 2 reach breakpoint. The important thing is to just have meaningful and good experience that aligns with the purpose you have set out. And with this, we have reached to the end of the final principle, but let's one more time go through the principles with the purpose that they have for doing better balancing and economy design. Treating balance as a tool or as an action. Basically, it should help you to focus on how to balance rather than what to balance. Having a purpose is about having a goal to balance for that supports the game. Understanding the relationships is about understanding the game to balance the values correctly. Knowing the audience is to balance for the randomness that comes from the player and the variables that you cannot just measure with math. Using the common denominator is about setting all the balanceable entities and variables and values on the same scale, so you don't have balancing errors which can lead to potentially very bad or game-breaking errors. Isolating the systems is about reducing the number of connections between systems, so you can have a clear structure to make balancing easier and also make the progression better for the player. And balancing for game experience is essentially just making sure that the balancing serves the purpose of making the game better, to have a proper experience, so that the game is just feeling better. And with that, I thank you all for listening.